G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Best Fiends a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So one of my favourite guilty pleasures is just kicking back and binging through a good TV series. Raised by Wolves was my most recent, but one thing that I feel exactly zero guilt about is how much I enjoy playing Best Fiends. Best Fiends gives me an endless source of fun that I can access anytime right on my phone. It's a match 3 puzzle game like none other, with literally thousands of levels and new content added all the time. I've been playing for some time now and I'm a little obsessed. Well, maybe a lot obsessed in fact. I've really enjoyed the levels and the puzzles though, especially some of the boss levels, and I've been playing with my kids lately, which has been a lot of fun. We started a new game to get the basics down, and now that we've done that, my kids and I play most afternoons as a bit of a treat after homework. I think I've been playing casually for maybe about a year now, I think, and I'm now a little over 900 levels in my own game, and I'm still finding new elements to the game. But starting again and playing with my kids has been a lot of fun too, and I think that's what I love about Best Fiends the most. It's a fantastic boredom quencher, it's great for casual gameplay and moments of downtime throughout the day, but I also love that more levels, events, challenges are always being added, so the game never really runs out of things to do. The game is free to download, and with Best Fiends, there's something new today, and tomorrow, and every day after that. So, if you never get tired of solving puzzles, good news. With Best Fiends, the fun never ends. So, download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. So I used to own a house near the mountains in the northern side of Colorado. This was a period of time when I had just gotten fired from my job because of COVID-related reasons and was home alone. I lived with my roommate at the time, but he went out to some club that night, leaving me alone with my dog. And to be honest, I hate to even think of this. This is the first time I've ever really told anyone besides my neighbors. So, it was around 8 p.m. on a Friday, and I was watching Friends on the TV. But while watching, I heard what sounded like boxes shuffling around in the basement. My dog immediately noticed this too and brought his head up. Our basement wasn't finished, and we had a window down there which wasn't in good shape, so I had just brushed it off thinking that the wind was making noise. After a while though, the noise just never really stopped. I decided to grab my light and head down there with my dog. I grabbed my light from the kitchen and opened the door to the basement. I started walking down the stairs, calling my dog. The only odd thing was that my dog decided to not come down with me and was making that, high-pitched noises dogs sort of make when they're, unhappy or whatever. He refused to go down there in the basement and just stood at the top of the basement. To give you perspective on how my basement was laid out, there was a lot of my extra stuff from my childhood, like clothes and such, that were in the back right corner, so when you walk down them on the very right, that is where that stuff is. All of my roommate's stuff was right next to mine on the left, and there was a bench with all of the previous owner's stuff that they left there. So, while going down there, the sound was still very clear and was getting louder and louder the farther that I got in there. I saw the window open and making noises and decided to go and close it. But as soon as I closed it, it felt like a hand grabbed my leg. But it wasn't a normal hand, it was super hot. My legs were swooped back and I actually fell over, and all I can remember from this point was my dog barking extremely loud. I then woke up and found myself in the closet of my roommate's bedroom. I walked downstairs and looked at the time. It was 3 and my roommate wasn't back yet. I looked at the clock and grabbed my phone, dog, and ran outside the front door. I went over to the neighbors around maybe a mile away, and I ran there bare feet. I didn't have a car at the time, so that was the only way to get there. But when I got to the neighbors, that I barely knew, mind you, I rang the doorbell extremely quickly, and around a minute later a man opened the door and asked why I was ringing his door this late at night, and I could tell that he was quite frustrated with me. I told him everything, and he said that the previous owners moved out because the husband actually ended everything in that basement. We talked for a while, and I let my dog run around in the back. I called my roommate to not go home and come over to the neighbors. Around an hour later, he showed up, and we all just sat there and talked about what had happened. At around 10 in the morning, I headed back to my house with my roommate to find the sofa flipped over, all the doors open, and the cabinets in the kitchen all open with dishes on the floor broken just everywhere. And after that, I decided to go live with my sister and sell the house around 2 months later. To this day, I'm still not sure what that was and haven't had any other experiences. But by the way, something that I didn't tell was that I had just broken up with my girlfriend. I've heard before that spirits thrive off of bad energy or whatever, and I don't know if that was the case, but let me know what you guys think, because I would sure love an explanation for this one. This story takes place in May of 2016. I went camping with my boyfriend at the time, his name is D, and another couple who I was friends with. We decided to drive down to a place called Point Lookout State Park, located at the southernmost point of Maryland. It was a rather large campground with 3 separate loops of campsites. 2 loops were located in a more wooded area, while the loop that we were stayed was directly on the water. Our loop was also less crowded, with only 1 other tent set up. I should mention too that Point Lookout is a very flat piece of land on the Chesapeake Bay, much of the place being sort of marshland. There is also a neat old lighthouse a very short drive from the loop. Anyway, I didn't look up anything about the area before going. Honestly, I was just happy to have a little vacation, as I was going through a hard time in my life. We pitched camp at the most perfect spot on the loop, and it was directly on the water but far enough from the road to not be seen by other people, with a curtain of tall grass guarding the view from anyone else. Basically, the perfect spot to drink and smoke without being bothered. This was actually my first time camping, and Dee wasn't very into it either, so we pitched a pretty pathetic loose tent, but it didn't matter since we were barely in the tent except to sleep. We walked around and checked out the area for a bit, walking through the camping loops and along the shoreline. The whole area just gave me a slightly weird feeling that is hard to describe, like a solemn silence that also felt very heavy, if that makes sense. At one point, I broke off from the group to use the bathroom facility. As I was walking along the trail, I saw a huge, and I mean huge, terrapin tortoise walking across the path directly in front of me. As it walked, it kind of made eye contact with me and didn't break it. It wasn't a terribly strange experience, but again, it just felt off. When I came out of the bathroom, the tortoise was gone, even though it was walking extremely slow, so that was weird. The first night, though, was pretty much uneventful, besides the extreme wind that blew through the park. As I said, the park is located right on the bay on very flat land, so it's a frequent experience. Unfortunately, though, since I pitched the most mediocre and loose tent, it blew around all night and felt like it was going to lift off from the ground and take us with it. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep that night. The second day, though, we decided to explore the old lighthouse. It was their spring season, so they had open tours for a few hours during the day. And there was a tour guide who gave the history of the house and gave some really cool facts about it too. But one thing the guide seemed to breeze right over, though, but stuck with me, was that the man who built the house, along with the next 2 owners, died very shortly after living in the house. The guide treated that little fact like it was nothing, but to me it was a bit weird. Anyway, we continued to hike, drink, smoke, and do all the other camping shenanigans, just having a great time. It was time to go to bed now, though, and this is where things get strange. This night was not windy at all. In fact, it was weirdly dead silent. Not a comforting silence, too, but an eerie silence that puts you on edge. I eventually got to sleep pretty quickly despite this, considering that I barely slept the previous night. But not long after I sunk into a deep sleep, Dee wakes me up, looking concerned. Hey, babe, did you hear that? He asked. No, I was asleep. Sorry, what happened? I asked. He replied with, I heard someone yell, hey, outside of our tent. I think there's a man outside. I didn't think too much of it at first. In fact, I thought it was just the other couple talking to each other since their tent was pretty much right next to ours. But then I heard our friends snoring. They're the loudest snorers I've ever met in my entire life. I mean, the other loops could probably hear them from here. But that meant that they were fast asleep and obviously not talking to each other or us. I was still skeptical that Dee heard anything, but we were drinking and smoking all night, so it could have been just paranoia. That is, until I heard the footsteps. Circling around our tent now was the sound of heavy boots making their way along the gravel. The steps had a little sort of clanking sound like one of those old-time steel boots. This was definitely not paranoia. We both looked at each other and thought, who the heck was at our tent and what did they want? The mesh window of our tent was open and we could see outside and around us, and we watched above and around us, following the sound of the footsteps with our eyes, but never actually seeing a single person. I got chills until the sound made its way back down the path and eventually disappeared. Dee and I looked at each other and just said, what the heck was that? We left the next day as planned and we told our friends what happened. They were fast asleep and didn't hear anything, they said anyway, which wasn't surprising. Those two could sleep through a tornado, to be honest. But this is where the story came together. You see, when I got home, I decided to research the park a bit, and suddenly everything started to make sense. You see, Point Lookout was once a Civil War prisoner camp. Buried all around the park were the bodies of Confederate soldiers. The prison housed prisoners in horrible conditions and was constantly overcrowded. But there are stories of all sorts of terrible things at that camp, and even in the basement of the lighthouse too. And the ghost sightings were abundant from others, many stating that they've heard or seen prison guards patrolling the area, and even questioning some of the park guests. I was convinced that that was what we experienced that night. The sound of the heavy boots and the loud hey seemed to match the other descriptions. There are also stories of people seeing a woman walking along the shore of the beach. Apparently she comes up and asks people where her headstone is and if they can help her find it. Turns out there was a woman buried in a nearby cemetery whose headstone was in fact stolen. It was found in a hotel in Washington, D.C. some 50 years later and allegedly was never put back. And I can only assume that she's going to walk the shoreline until they put it back, if they ever actually do. Anyway, I actually kind of want to go back there now that I know the history of the park. For anyone who has been to Point Lookout, have you ever experienced anything strange there? I would love to hear your stories if you have. That is, if you would like to share them. For context, we're female, and when this happened back in mid-February of 2020, my friends and I were all 15. This takes place in Italy on a school trip that we went on. The trip itself was alright, I suppose, but being the dumb teenagers that we are, well, we decided to push the boundaries a bit. Our school had booked us into a pretty average hotel, low budget, so one night, two of my friends asked me if I wanted to sneak out with them during the night and go to the nearby beach. I'm generally quite sensible, but they kept persuading me until I finally gave in. I mean, we would only get one opportunity to do this, right? So we waited until about 1 a.m., messaging each other when to leave our rooms and meet in the corridor. It was only 3 of us. We didn't want anyone else to know, as they might snitch on us. The teachers were sleeping in rooms opposite ours, so we had to be so quiet as to not get caught. And I can remember still just how worried I was that we would get caught and that they would ring my parents. But we were successful and we snuck our way down to the lobby. For whatever reason, too, no one was at the front desk, so we just hurried through the lobby and out the front door, not waiting around to get caught. None of us actually knew Italian too, so this is quite possibly one of the dumbest things we could have done. We walked for about 2 miles down the beach, all smug that we had actually managed to pull off our perfectly devised plan. The streets were completely empty, not surprising considering that it was like 1 in the morning, but it didn't stop that anxious feeling in the back of my mind. I knew that what we were doing would get us in so much trouble if we got caught. We had to walk down hundreds of steps in order to actually get to the beach. Plenty of time to reconsider our actions, but we were stupid and kept on going. Something that I regret now. The beach, though, was really quite beautiful that night. It was a full moon and the beach was lit up in a beautiful soft light. We had the whole place to ourselves and it was quite nice. We messed around for 10 minutes or so and then my friends said that they wanted to go into the sea. I was adamant that I wasn't going in despite their protests, so they told me to keep an eye on their stuff. But we had only brought a few jackets and our phones. They rolled up their trousers and went knee-deep into the sea. I started filming them and taking pictures. The others would be so jealous, I remember thinking. But just wait until they see these photos. They must have spent about, I would guess, 5 minutes splashing around in the cold sea before they came back onto the beach and started stripping off more. I couldn't believe it. They were actually going to go swimming. They had the genius idea as well to go in there in their underwear, and I couldn't stop laughing at this point. Looking back on it now, I should have persuaded them not to. I didn't understand the gravity of the situation that we would soon be in, but they both ran towards the waves and jumped in at the same time, screaming and giggling in the freezing water. I stood on the shore just laughing and filming them. Whilst guarding their things, I suddenly got this eerie feeling of being watched. I can only put it down to the instinct, but naturally I put my guard up and I looked around. And man, am I so glad that I did, because who knows what would have happened if I didn't notice them. 2 men were sitting maybe 30 meters away from us in the dark. I can't be sure as I only noticed them for a second before turning back around, but it looked like one of the men was holding his phone up filming us. My stomach instantly dropped though. I called both my friends though, and they must have noticed the tone in my voice was completely shaken despite my best efforts to be discreet, but they walked up the sand towards me, dripping wet and freezing cold. I told them 2 men were sitting behind us, watching us, and at that, I'd never seen them so scared. That's when the trepidation hit us, I think. No one knew that we were here. As far as everyone else was concerned, we were fast asleep in our hotel rooms. These men could easily take us down, kidnap us, and do whatever they wanted to do. And honestly, no one would ever even know. I quickly whispered to my friends that we needed to leave right now. I told them to not bother getting dressed and to just grab their stuff and leave as inconspicuously as possible. They agreed with no hesitation, and at this point I was really worried. The men must have known that we saw them, despite our best efforts. Nothing could conceal the raw fear that we felt, and probably looked too. As we approached the steps, I made a quick glance behind us, and a sweat instantly broke out on my forehead, because the men were now slowly walking towards us. Fight or flight kicked in, and I shouted at my friends to run. Barefoot and soaked, they scrambled up the steps as quickly as they could. We kept pushing, and I didn't look behind me for fear of how close they could be. We didn't stop once we reached the top of the steps and onto the pavement, but we were running on pure adrenaline at this point. Our legs burned, and I looked down to see both my friends' feet were now bloody, but they didn't stop. But we didn't stop running until the hotel was in sight, and I turned around again, and to my relief, I could no longer see the men. We walked through the entrance to the hotel, and this time, however, there was a man at the front desk. He started talking in Italian, and we didn't understand him, so we kept walking, my friends leaving bloody footprints through the lobby. Once we reached the corridor, we made a mutual vow to never tell anyone about that night, and we all went back to our rooms. The man at the front desk, though, must have told our teachers that he saw us at 3 a.m. walking through this hotel, leaving bloody footprints everywhere, because that morning I awoke to a loud banging on our door. Miss Smith was shouting at everyone, asking who it was that left last night. Of course, everyone was confused, and I didn't dare speak up, neither did my friends. After several speeches about the severity of our actions and how they were going to find out who it was, I was completely terrified. My two friends finally spoke up and admitted that it was them. Thankfully, they left my name out, which I'll forever be grateful for. The teachers, man, they were furious, as you can imagine, I suppose. They received phone calls home, and they had to delete all the pictures taken that night. I always think back to how that night could have ended, though, how horribly wrong it could have gone. And despite it being one of the dumbest things that I've ever done, I'm glad that I decided to go, because it terrifies me to think what could have happened to my two friends if I wasn't there to spot those men that night. For a short period in my life, I lived in my car. But don't worry, my life is a lot better now, but when you live in a car, you pick up systems. Ways to keep your car clean, and places you can shower for cheap, and most importantly, where to sleep. I mostly bounced around the different Walmarts in the area. I lived in the south where there's tons to pick from. It's good to pick different parking lots so you don't attract attention for going to the same one every night in a row. I always made it a rule to sleep under a light in the parking lot, but one night, the Walmart that I picked didn't really have good spots in the light, so I figured that I would just sleep in whichever spot in the back and go to bed after a long day at work. And as I woke up to the sun rising, I saw two handprints left by a stranger outside my window. And that convinced me to always park in the lights no matter what, and maybe avoid that specific Walmart too. Quite honestly too, I'm just happy that whoever it was just wanted to look and left me alone, because all I had on me was pepper spray, and that wouldn't have worked out so well if I'd used it while I was inside of my car. It was the late 1970s, 2 a.m. I was travelling from Cape Cod to RI to visit my significant other at Brown, and I pulled over in a rest area on I-195 near Fall River to take a leak. As expected, the rest stop was empty, no cars, so I got out of the car and walked about 6 feet into the thick woods, and I took a much-needed pee. About halfway through emptying my bladder, though, I suddenly noticed out of the corner of my eye, in the pitch blackness at no more than must have been 3 feet away from me, the unmistakable bright red glow of a cigarette, hand high, off the ground. No sound, no motion, just a red glow in the black night. Right next to me, in the middle of, absolutely nowhere, at 2 a.m. And I honestly thought at that moment that I was about to become a statistic. My heart instantly went into my throat. I reeled in the goods, and I just noped the heck out of there. And surprisingly, I got back to my car without incident, because the dude, whoever he was, never made a sound. My heart was still racing when I got to my significant other's dorm. She was sleepy, of course, but 40 plus years ago, and it was such a fright that I still remember it as if it had occurred last night. So when I was 7 or 8, we used to live in Webster, Wisconsin, and we lived in a house a little bit wider and longer than a trailer house. No upstairs, just the base floor and a basement. It was actually a beautiful house with a big area that was pretty much just woods. And one day my cousin was supposed to be watching my two sisters and I, and he said that we could all go outside and play as long as we stayed in his sight. But within 5 minutes, he ran into the woods and told us to keep up. Of course, we listened to him. We ran after him and he disappeared. We couldn't see the house or even the tree line where the wood stopped. And at this point, we were lost and we started freaking out and crying, and then about half an hour later, a really tall Native American chief came up behind us and asked us what was wrong, why we were crying, are we okay, are we lost. I told him how we were chasing my cousin and we lost him, we don't know how to get back home, and he smiles and says, "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll make sure you get home safe and sound. Just come to my village and rest for a little bit, eat some lunch, play with the children, and when you're ready you can explain to me where you live." I said okay to this, and so we go back to his village. And it's a smaller one in the middle of the woods in a sort of clearing, but it had at least 60 people there, and we ate a stew of something that they had made, and he had me draw on the dirt, the road, and our house, and he smiled and said, "I know exactly where you live. If you want to play for a little bit, that's okay, but I want to get you home before it's dark, because there's lots of dangers in these woods, like bears and coyotes, bobcats. Not good for children to be out in the dark like that." So he took us home, and he didn't leave the edge of the woods, but my mum came out crying, asking where we were, saying that she was about to call the cops that we were missing for about 4 to 5 hours. She asked us why we left the house without Scotty, my cousin, and I said that he was with us. He ran into the woods and left us behind. Well, we tried to call out for him, but he was gone. And then he came outside and said that he had actually never left the house, and he thought that we were in our rooms, so I told my mum what had happened, and she said that we'll just figure it out tomorrow. The next day comes, and we went out and followed our footprints, and we actually found the village, or at least what used to be a village, because there was almost nothing there now. What had been a gorgeous place was now just ash. It had all been burned down, and the grass, which was shorter the day before, now stood taller than me, and it looked like it was burned down and left vacant for hundreds of years. We called out for them, surely expecting a response, but we didn't get anything. And after some time of sort of walking around and shouting out to try and find some people and finding a few things here or there, we ended up just sort of giving up and heading home. I still think about that day a lot and what had happened, and obviously it's all very confusing, but I don't know. What do you guys think? So, I've been wanting to share this story with you guys for a while now, but I just haven't, and I thought that now was the time, so here it goes. In 2007, when I was 12 years old, my family and I took a trip to Florida with some of my cousins and family friends. Naturally, while at the resort, my cousins and I would all hang out at the kids club, where there were always a bunch of kids to hang out with, epic chicken fingers and ranch dressing, and fun games for us to play just all round. There was a director of the kids club who watched us and facilitated all of the activities. His name was Dan. In retrospect, Dan was a major creep. He was around 40 years old, super tall and skinny, and was balding terribly. But the worst part is that sometimes he had us call him Dan the Animal Man. Side note too, these sort of memories leave me in awe of just how naive and blinded to danger I was, and I'm sure most were as a kid. If I ever met this guy now, I literally wouldn't want to get in within a 5-foot radius of him. And there I was as a 12-year-old thinking that he rocked. Time is a truly wonderful thing, right? Anyhow, I digress, but it was made clear to all of us that, for unknown reasons, Dan was leaving the hotel in a week. None of this really fazed me, but on our last day of the hotel, I lost my cell phone. It was a bright blue chocolate cell phone, if anyone remembers those gems with the spinning wheel. But I quickly told my parents that I just couldn't find my phone anywhere. And considering that this was already the second phone that I lost that year, my mum yelled at me and told me that if I didn't find it, that I'd be grounded. I hurriedly ran around the hotel looking for my phone everywhere, and along my way I went into the kids' club to see if anyone had found it. The room that was typically bustling with kids and activity was now eerily quiet and empty. But Dan was sitting on a couch, all by himself. "Hey Dan, did you by any chance see my phone anywhere?" I asked. Dan responded, "Yeah, actually, I found it and I put it in the lost and found in the basement. Come with me, I'll show you." Thinking absolutely nothing of this, I mindlessly followed behind Dan as he led me around the back of the hotel. We walked for about 3 minutes, I would say, and arrived at the foot of a stairwell going into the basement. We were standing at the back of the hotel in a really strange area, and nobody else was in sight. "It's down here?" I asked, confused. I was staring down a long flight of stairs leading to absolute darkness. The walls were made of unpainted concrete, and it looked no more than a storage area, let alone a basement with a lost and found. Dan nodded and held the door open for me, motioning for me to head down the steps. But something in my 12-year-old self just suddenly woke up. I'm not sure if it was instinct, fear, or maybe it was just luck, but I immediately knew that I needed to get the heck out of there now. Before Dan could say or do anything too, I just blurted out, "Never mind, I think I left it with my mum," and darted away from the stairwell and back to the hotel lobby. I was so shook up by this because just something about that situation didn't feel right. I just knew that he was going to hurt me, and as a kid who wore rose-colored glasses and was overly trusting of others, this really meant something to me. I tried to compose myself and I figured that I'd investigate a bit more. I walked up to the concierge of the hotel and asked them where the lost and found is because I lost my phone. The nice woman at the front desk told me that the lost and found was right there at their desk. She then asked what kind of phone I lost, and after I told her that it was a blue chocolate flip phone, she smiled and pulled it out of the box under her desk. "Yeah, someone turned it in earlier," she said, and handed me my phone. "Wait, you're telling me the lost and found isn't in the basement?" I stammered. "No, sweetie. The hotel is under construction and the basement is just being rebuilt. There's no electricity down there or anything yet." This absolutely scared me half to death. I just couldn't shake the feeling that this man, he was dangerous. At the time, I was sharing a hotel room with my cousin, and she was the only person that I told. Considering that she was only 8 at the time, I think I really freaked her out too. But I'm now 26, and I still think back to that moment, and wonder just, what if? What would have happened if I'd gone down into the basement with Dan the Animal Man? It feels truly like one of the most critical junctures of my entire life, and I'm just really happy that I knew to get the heck out of there before it was too late. And recently I contacted the hotel to inquire about past Kid Club employees named Dan from 2007, just to see if he's still around or not, or on a sex offenders list, or in jail. I even told HR this whole story, but they just still refused to give me any information about him, and sounded pretty sketchy about it too. I'll continue to do some more research, and if I ever find more information, then I'll be sure to share it with you guys here. But thanks for listening. So I worked for a very major retailer that you've probably all heard of. This was from about 1.5 years ago, I'd say. So, back when I worked in the electronics and photo departments. Now, one afternoon I answered the phone and I spoke to a customer. He wasn't very direct about what exactly he was looking for, At first he said that he was looking for a gift for a family member that he hated. He said that he wanted it to be something that they would accept because of the obligation, but would absolutely hate. I asked if he was looking for a type of gag gift or something, and he just sort of dodged my question. Instead, he started asking me about what I would buy if I wanted to get a gift for a family member like that. I said that I just really wasn't sure, but maybe a movie or some music that they didn't like would be a good choice. Then, he surprised me by asking what type of movies that I like to watch. I said that it wasn't anything that would really fit what he was looking for, as I usually watched anime. And next he asked that if that was something that I would want to watch over dinner. I said that I certainly do watch it while I eat dinner sometimes, not knowing where he was going with this at first. But then he said, no, I meant with me. I just sort of laughed nervously at this, and I told him no. Then I quickly changed the subject back to what he was looking for, and he asked if we had a certain TV series in stock. I told him that I would go and check. By this point I was feeling pretty uncomfortable, but I still wanted to keep my customer service going and not disappoint the customer by being rude. So I found what he was looking for and then told him the price and how many copies were in stock and whatnot. After this, he asked me some other questions about myself, and in the end, I just sort of told him that perhaps I wasn't the best person to help him, and then I handed the phone off to a male co-worker. I walked away from the desk at that point and made my way back to the photo department, where I felt safer as I wasn't in the direct view of customers who were walking around and whatnot. I took a moment to collect myself before I left, and this next part was my co-worker's interaction with the customer on the phone. So my co-worker introduced himself in the usual manner and asked how he could help. The man then said, "Oh man, where did that cute, bubbly girl go?" My co-worker replied with an improvised response of, "Oh, she's actually our photo associate and she doesn't know as much about electronics." To which the customer responded with, "Oh, I'd like to see some pictures of her naked." To which my co-worker really didn't know how to respond. The customer then said that it would be easier to just shop in person and that he'd be back later to see me, and then he hung up. I asked my co-worker if he was ever able to get the customer off the phone, and he told me about what the customer said, and quite honestly, I really felt sick. I was also pretty terrified of coming into contact with this customer that I went to management and reported the issue to them. They just chuckled and said that there wasn't anything that they could do, as if it was likely just a prank caller. I was worried though about spending any time on the sales floor, but I still had to complete my shift. That evening I was quite terrified, and I politely asked a male co-worker to walk me to my car. He obliged, and we saw no trace of any creepy guys anywhere, and I never heard from him again ever since then, but it's weird how things like this can just put you on edge and make you look over your shoulder constantly. It's a horrible way to live, and it's something that I really don't wish upon anyone.